Medicine treats us to work hard and to be self-sufficient. Be steady, be reliable, be the one who holds it together when bad things happen. And most of the time, I'd say that we do just that. We lead hard conversations with our patients. We deliver bad news. We sit with patients and families in the difficult moments that have no easy answers. And then we walk out and we go into the next room. No pause, no processing. Rarely with the benefit of someone checking in with us. No wonder many of us start to feel like this is just our own to carry. Like, if something feels heavy, are we just going to be strong enough to carry it? Any wonder this can feel burnout. So I wanted to look at this from a different perspective. What if it's not actually about how much we carry, but how much we've been doing it alone? Today, I'm really excited to have Dr. Natalie Bowersox with me. She's a obstetrician gynecologist from the Cleveland Clinic and currently serves as the Vice Chief of Education of the Western Submarket. She spent nearly a decade as a residency program director, working closely with trainees as they navigated not just the clinical needs of the program, but some of its most difficult and emotionally complex moments. In a system that often pushes physicians to function like individuals, Dr. Bowersox brings a perspective grounded in something different: connection, team, and the recognition that we were really never meant to do this alone. Natalie, thank you for being here today and welcome to Heal the Burn.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I always like to start by asking my guests to give us a little background. How is it that you came to decide to do a career in medicine?
Yeah, sure. I'm a bit of a cliche. So I grew up on the west side of Cleveland, the oldest of four siblings. So um, definitely the bossy one and the one that had to be in charge. So medicine was a natural, I think, a good fit for me and something that sounded like I wanted to do. I was the first in my family to go to college,
Mm,
first in my family to be a physician. And so a lot of my journey, I kind of had to make up as I went along. And so I really had to rely on friends and friends' parents and those kinds of things to sort of help me along. Because I actually didn't know what I was doing. And my parents were supportive, but they didn't know what I was doing either. And so I think it was a little bit of an adventure for all of us. And so I'll give you an example. When I applied for college, I went to community college for the first 2 years and was able to do that on a scholarship. And so when I applied for the second 2 years, I had chosen Baldwin Wallace, now university, was college at the time, and said, "How many students get into medical school here?" And they said, "All of them." And I didn't think to ask how many apply, which was on average at that time 4. So so always a proponent of helping out those first generation, folks that are going through the journey.
right.
But, I think was able to matriculate in medical school in Toledo and then decided to do OBGYN and did my residency in upstate New York in Albany, and then came back to be closer to family in Cleveland.
I want to get into what brought you toward OBGYN, but even taking a step back without any sort of medicine in the family, even college in the family, what kind of experiences did you have that led you to believe this was a possibility?
I think that some of it went back to most of it goes back to my parents and, this sort of belief that if you work hard enough at something, you can make it happen.
Mm,
And I also had, a particularly supportive grandmother, so my grandma on my dad's side of the family who truly believed we could do anything we wanted. So, when you've got those kind of people in your corner and you in a lot of ways don't know any better. You don't know that you can't be successful.
mhm.
To me, it was like, well, I wanna do this, so I'm gonna do it. And that made it a little more palatable to sort of figure it out as I went along.
Sure. Do you remember some of the things that drove you toward OBGYN as you're going through medical school?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that I definitely lean towards OBGYN, and I don't exactly know why it first appealed to me other than to say that advocating for women um, was very important to me at an early age
Mhm.
of this need for women in the fields of science, women in medicine. And I think that part was very attractive to me. When I did the rotation as a medical student, I was just hooked. I mean, I remember following so Kevin McCumsey is an OBGYN that works at the Cleveland Clinic, and he was my resident. And I just followed him around labor and delivery at St. Vincent's Hospital in Toledo. I was like, "This is for me." And then I did a rotation at Metro Health as a 4th year medical student, and the first night I did 6 deliveries, and I was like, "I'm in." I mean, I don't wanna do anything else. I don't know why they let me do that. Uh, it was July, and I was a brand new 4th year medical student, and I was like, "Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do whatever you want me to do." And so, I had a great time. And no matter I liked surgery, I liked, internal medicine. I mean, it was hard. I think the only thing I knew I didn't wanna necessarily do was maybe pediatrics,
Mhm.
just because it just seemed too hard. You know, I wanted patients to be able to tell me what they what was wrong with them. And so, I think that was the only one that wasn't really appealing, but it really, I think having sisters, having friends, you know, hearing the journeys that they had in healthcare made me want to make the specialty better and more accessible for them, and I think that's really what kinda drew me in initially.
That's great. At what point in your career did you find yourself becoming interested in leadership?
Well, I think, you know, OBGYN is interesting. It's very team-based, right? And so it's a team-based approach right out of the gate, and so when I hear about other specialties, you know, having challenges with teams, it's hard for me to wrap my head around because it's just so woven into what we do, and
Mhm.
so I think my chief year as a resident, I was the administrative chief, and I think that was probably the start of my leadership journey professionally, you know, bossy oldest daughter in student council in high school, you know, president of a couple of things in college. And so I definitely had that interest in knowing more about what being a leader meant.
Mm. When you and I have spoken in the past, you've said that each of us tend to act like we're an island. And I'm wondering, where do you think that belief comes from in medicine?
I think it stems from the idea that because you're a physician, you have to have all the answers and there's not room for error.
Mhm.
There's not room to make mistakes, and we don't like talking about that when that happens, and we certainly don't like talking about that when there's a bad outcome. And I think that that's where it stems for a lot of us is that there are high stakes in what we do, and we're not very forgiving of ourselves when something might not go the way we think it should have.
How early in training do you see that sort of start to take hold in people?
You know, I think that it depends on what a trainee or a resident or a physician did before they got to medical school and residency. And so I think that you certainly start to see it at the end of medical school when you're starting to do clinical rotations, right? In 3rd
Mhm.
and 4th year, and
Yeah.
you get a little bit of responsibility, but not enough where typically you can get in trouble. And then you get to residency and, you know, you think you need to have all the answers on July 1st, and you don't, right? I mean, what do they say? Don't get sick in July.
Right?
Um, and so, you know, I mean, in all seriousness, though, you know, I think that's start of residency where there's this sort of implication like, now I got to know everything. And we all know that that's the whole point of residency, right? Is to get that training, to get that understanding. But you do, I think, that weighs heavy And it can feel pretty isolating when you're talking to friends, when you're talking to colleagues that are in different specialties. And even when you're thinking about your classmates, I think even though you might have 3 or 5 or 10 people that are in a class with you, they're not going through that day to day alongside you. You're somewhat siloed maybe on what service you're on or what experiences you're having. And so I think that it starts then and gets perpetuated sometimes by not knowing all the answers and somebody being worried that they might get found out, right? I
Mhm.
don't know everything and should. And so I think that that's a lot of times where that behavior starts is you kind of want to hide away when you don't feel like you did your best.
Yeah. I had the great opportunity to hear you speak at the Joy and Purpose seminar this past spring here in Cleveland. And you had shared a story about a resident who was caring for a patient connected to a traumatic delivery in which the baby didn't survive. And what it struck me was you said you didn't really you didn't show any concern whether the resident had medical knowledge what to do. You went up to the resident and asked if they were okay. What what made you ask the resident that question at that time?
Well, a couple things. One is I knew that that was her first experience with something like that. And I wanted to give her the space to talk about how she was feeling and to acknowledge that. I think that people didn't necessarily do that for me when
Mm,
I was in a more vulnerable position, and so when they did, I really appreciated that. Not the acknowledgement, but more the checking in to see if I'm okay, and then was I okay later, and so
mhm,
for that resident, I think that part was really important to me, that I knew that this type of occurrence would likely happen again sometime during her training, and that I wanted to make sure that she knew it was okay to talk about how she was feeling.
mm. What do you think people underestimate about moments like that?
I think how strongly it impacts them. So, when I think about OBGYN, there's a lot of people think, "Oh, your specialty is really happy, and it's really exciting," and it is, right? We get to do deliveries, we get to be part of a family experience with patients that is really, really unique.
Mhm,
When it doesn't go well, it's pretty horrific, as you can imagine. And so I think that, acknowledging that is really important and, also creating space to be able to talk about, like, you might feel okay right now, but tonight when you go to bed or on the weekend when maybe you don't have call and you start to think about that a little bit, I want you to know that I'm available and you have support and you're going to feel a lot of different things and they're all okay.
yeah. I've certainly experienced in my career that in a tough moment, I wonder if we focus too much on what to say and not enough on what it feels like just to be there.
It's not easy to sit with people in that space. And I think we get experience doing that with patients, right? It's intrinsic in what we do, and it's hard to sit and give patients that space. We definitely don't do it for each other, and we say, "Oh, you're good? Okay. Can you go to that?" The next patient needs their water broke and their cervix checked, and you're 2 hours behind in notes, and "You're good? Okay, I'll talk to you later." And so, we're very good at doing it for patients. We're not great at doing it for each other by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about another area of your interest, which is surrounding conflict. What do you think that we get wrong about conflict in medicine practice?
I think that's a hard question to answer, just in the sense that we wanna do the right thing, and we want to meet patients where they are,
Hmm.
but in doing that, we gotta recognize that we don't always know what patients want and what they wanna get out of that interaction with us. And so part of that is driven by, this need to see patients and see a lot of them and see them efficiently. And the pushback from the patient of they waited a long time to see you maybe, or maybe they drove a long way to see you, and having expectations around that. And then when it doesn't go well, or when, maybe you're not answering the question that they're asking,
Hmm.
how do you stop yourself from reacting negatively to sort of figuring out, okay, how do I not necessarily save it, but how do I move this in a direction where it's mutually satisfying, both the provider and the patient, or the provider and the family, and those types of things. And a lot of that, I think, kind of comes from asking more open-ended questions, things that I certainly didn't learn in training,
Mm.
right? Like, I learned how to interview a patient, I learned a physical exam, I learned how to be a very skilled surgeon,
Hmm.
but I don't necessarily think I learned to say something like, "Tell me more about that," or, "Can you say more about how you feel?" Like, I've gotten that. It's always interesting in medicine, right? Like, a lot of times we get the skill training for the skills we need earlier,
Yeah,
and then you take a leadership journey, and you're like, "Where were these skills 5 years ago when I needed this?" Like,
absolutely.
it's like they should have given me this in college or medical school or residency. But I think that I think a lot of it is around, certainly around expectation setting,
Hmm.
and, being able to sit in that space with patients and start to try to understand, how did we get here, and is there a way to, keep moving forward?
And I also want to expand this sort of to the extent of the way that we behave on our team with the other people on our team. I'm just wondering if there's like an idea about what we carry inside, but what we avoid saying in many situations, and I'm wondering if that resonates with you in your experience.
So, I mean, I think that medicine is pretty historically hierarchical, right? And so there's an attending,
Hmm.
and there's a fellow or a resident, and there's a medical student. There's nursing that is working alongside of us, and there's sort of a role that goes with each of those positions, right? And so when there's something that, you know, someone missed or someone misspoke about, it's very difficult when you are the more junior person on that team to be able to speak up and talk about what, you're like, "Oh, well, no, actually the patient, her CBC was this, or her
Hmm.
blood, or her, she actually said, oh, she was feeling much better this morning." And so how do you manage that in a way where if you're the more junior person, you feel safe enough to say those things? And
Yeah.
I think of a space many years ago when I was a brand new attending where I had a misstep in the OR, and I talked to the person that was assisting me afterwards, and I said, "Why didn't you say something?" And he said, "Well, I don't really know you. I don't know you that well. I was afraid that you would be upset." And I mean, and that was a long time ago. Like, that was in 2003, and I can still picture that operating room in my mind. And so I'm very thoughtful about the tone in my operating room, in my office, on labor and delivery, so that, when conflicts arise, my team feels like we can work through it together. Because I never want to feel like I did that day in 2003 where I thought, shoot, this person could have stopped me from, making a misstep that I would have, it would have changed the trajectory of how the case was going. So,
Mm.
I think that sort of stands out for me in my memory.
Wow. That's a really heavy experience, and I'm sorry you carried it for all these years too, although my impression is it's probably kept you, safe. So, what do you see the difference between a hard conversation that resolves something and one that leaves people feeling worse or not heard?
I mean, I think that it's understanding like what I think your goals are at the start of the conversation. I think that's part of it is
Hmm.
what do I want to accomplish by what we're talking about today? I can lean on my role as a program director for that is in having hard conversations about people's performance. And, feedback is really important in residency training. And there's productive ways to give feedback and ways that are less productive and leave residents feeling potentially lost
Hmm.
or like they're not sure where they can go. And so that's why having lots of feedback is important from different sources. But in answer to your question, I think it's is in sort of framing that around what the topic is that you're giving people feedback or having conflict resolution about, and then what you do next, right? And I think that we run from conflict. As fast as we can. We have that conversation as quickly, especially if it's with a teammate, a partner, another physician, or somebody on the team. You have that conversation, and then you run away, and you hope that you don't have to run into them anytime soon, right? And so, sort of sitting there and marinating in that, like you can't do that when you're involved in resident education because you're going to see them at the next board sign out or the next education session or at grand rounds or in the clinic. And so it's really important that there's an understanding around we're having a conflict or a discussion about something that you need to make some changes or improve on. That conversation is over. We're now back to, normal activity. We're now back to a situation where, like, now we're moving forward. I think there has to be an ability to move forward and keep moving ahead rather than just sort of sitting in that space. We used to do peer evaluations for the residents, and they had the ability to evaluate each other and which included verbatims. And there could be 10 really, really nice comments and 1 negative comment, and all 9 get thrown out, and the negative comment is the only so much so that I eliminated verbatims because people, oftentimes high achievers, like, can also do some deficit thinking, right? And so the only thing that they focused on was the negative part of the feedback. And so I think that it's the same thing with the conflict of, trying to understand, like, we're trying to do a good job, we're trying to get better. It's important that we have these conversations, but also that then the conversation ends and things go on.
Right. Did you facilitate residents giving feedback on the preceptors?
Yes.
How did you find that to
Um,
work?
it's interesting. It's fine when that preceptor's doing well. But when there's, a challenge, around, someone potentially treating a trainee unkindly or putting them in a space that makes them uncomfortable, I think it's important to empower residents to be able to give that feedback. And a lot of times, though, that feedback would go through myself or someone else on the residency leadership team to make sure that that resident isn't put in a space where they're vulnerable.
Mm.
We wanna be able to give feedback. I mean, I think feedback is a two-way street, and so, being able to give concrete examples is very helpful, which is why having those discussions in the moment is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Before people have a chance to forget.
Yeah, for sure. Or things are so nebulous, like, you don't wanna say to somebody, "Everyone thinks that you're doing this badly." "Well, can you give me an example?" "No." That feedback becomes very, useless because it's not anchored in anything, right? And so you can't anchor it, and so there's no real way for that person to get better or work on resolving that because they don't really think it existed to begin with. So, I think that's the part where you gotta, talk about what happened or the conflict or any of those types of things as soon as it happens, closer to as soon as it happens as you can, just to sort of facilitate that being productive.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about how important it is for people to realize that they're not alone, be it training, be it patient interactions, be it at home. What do you think helps someone feel like they're not alone?
For me, it's having a touchstone, which for me is home, is my family. And for people at work, I think it's reaching out on a regular basis to make sure that you're just saying hello or you're checking in or maybe you're grabbing a cup of coffee. But having those, I think, touch points is what's been beneficial for me when my children were little and I was on call a lot. I had a picture of them on my pager, and until they didn't fit anymore, until they got too big to fit on the pager. But I think it's reminding yourself that this is not everything. And if it is, what can you do to expand your toolbox to make sure that this is not everything? Because when the job is all that you do and it doesn't go well, it's really hard to recover and it feels really isolating. And it doesn't mean you have to have crazy hobbies, but it does mean that you have to have an outlet, a place, a way to not think about work, and I think for me, that's been my family. It was also my kids' activities that they did. I think it was the ability to just be Kevin and Kira's mom and not Dr. Bowersox that was like, which reminded me that this was not all that I had, that there were people out there that needed me to fill different roles. And so I think that's the part that's helpful. I just wish somebody would have told me that in my 30s rather than trying to sort of stumble through it as I got older.
Do you think when you were in your 30s you could have heard it?
I think it would have been helpful for somebody to remind me that I didn't have to do all of it, that it was okay if I didn't go to that meeting, right? Or I didn't attend that course, or I didn't say yes to that project, but that I went to the Christmas show, for one of my kids, or I was able to go to the baseball game. But, I think I that sort of defines who I am. But if I ask my children that, they don't remember that. They think I was there, so I fooled them. But I think that, I think that I would have liked a reminder of, like the work's going to get done. It doesn't have to go into the evening or home or those types of things, and that it'll be there the next day, unless it's something that, that can't wait. But I
Right.
think all of the extra things that you carry with you are the ones that you have to give yourself permission to say, maybe that'll keep till tomorrow.
That's a hard one. I mean, I've done this for 26 years, and that continues to be a soft spot for me to be able to leave and think, "Okay, I can leave that until tomorrow."
It's I would say that that is always a work in progress for me.
I'm wondering if you see teams benefit in helping people feel alone by keeping them grounded. Sh how important you feel that connection is.
Well, I think it's everything. I think that when I walk into say, like I walk into a room for a patient that's going to have a delivery, I look on the dry erase board and say, okay, who's on my team tonight? Who am I working with? What do I know about the patient? I introduce myself and start to delve into how do I think this is going to go. And I'll say to the nurse, like, how's it going? Like, how do you think things are? Say to the resident, like, "What's the vibe? How are we doing?" And so I think that it takes a lot of the pressure off feeling like you've gotta do everything, know everything, be all things to all people, right? Like, you have plenty of responsibility. You have to be very versed in the patient's medical history, their course, what's happening with their experience with labor, and so having a group of people that shares that with you is, really mutually beneficial. And I think one of the things that we did 2 years ago was adding something called team birth on labor and delivery, which is basically team-based care where the patient is part of the huddle.
Mm.
And it sounded so hokey, and I wanted nothing to do with it. I was like, "I don't no, thank you. I don't want anything to do with this." Yeah, I don't wanna, like, stand there and listen to this sort of diatribe about what they want and don't want. But what it turned out to be was this great way for patients to be part of their care, and for us to know what patients wanted and for them to know what they could expect from the team. And, now we've been at it for a couple of years, and I think to myself, "I really don't know how we did this without it." And which, in some ways is humbling when you think like, "Oh, after 20 years, I got this." But you can always, I think, be more efficient or provide better care and those types of things. But I think it also gives everybody a role so they feel like if they're the medical student and they're holding a leg while a patient is pushing, or they're the nurse that's running the room or the resident that's helping with the delivery, that that the dad standing on the other side of the patient, everyone is part of that team. And so they're all experiencing it differently, but experiencing it together.
Yeah, there's not a lot of room for alone in that scenario.
No, definitely not. There was this show that used to be on TV called Scrubs, and my husband was a big Scrubs fan. And they were, I think, different residents, but mostly emergency medicine and general surgery. And when they'd consult the gynecology team, they would come in and, like, they'd have their hair blowing in the wind, and they'd all have white coats on, and they'd be dressed really nice, and they'd travel in a pack, and and so my husband's like, "You are a gyno girl," and, I was like, "Yeah, I wear that proudly," but I will say that definitely that is a part of our specialty that, we're quite good at, which is teamwork, so
That's fantastic. So if someone's listening, feeling like they're not on an effective team or feeling like they're carrying a lot on their own, what would you want them to hear?
I would say that they're not alone. And I would also say that they have more power than they think they do. And I think in medicine, you and I talked about how oftentimes we feel like an island and
Mhm.
we're afraid to ask for help. And that help looks like different things for different people, right? Whether that's a coach, whether that's help with mental health, whether that's getting in shape or starting an exercise routine. But having this idea that asking for help is a weakness rather than part of a growth mindset. And I think that that is really where we can make an impact. There are a lot of resources where I work around what's available to help employees. And having participated in that myself, taking advantage of those resources, referring friends and residents to those resources makes you realize there's a reason that they're there. And if you want to flourish and, be one of those crazy people that can say they've been practicing for 40 or 50 years, you have to be coming from a healthy mindset and know that you're not alone.
Yeah, I absolutely credit all of my professional success, and I've been really open about that on the podcast to the work that I've done with my coach.
Yes,
He can never leave and never retire.
that's right. And I think it's those types of things that we don't think we deserve or we don't think we need. We don't realize that, we would benefit from a coach or a mentor. I think sometimes mentors are easier, right? Because they oftentimes are serving a purpose, right? They're a research mentor or they're helping you with career exploration. But a coach comes at you from such a different approach that I think, if we could all have, certainly if I could get every resident that I get the chance to work with a coach, I think we would all find ourselves in a better place,
Hmm.
as we practice and go along. I mean, one of the things that you asked me earlier was, when I spoke with that resident, when we knew that we had that bad outcome. I had a resident reach out to me last week, um, just to say, "I'm having a really bad call shift. I had something bad happen. Can I talk to you?" And to me, that's a win for us. I can't make her feel better other than to let her have her space to tell me what happened and to sort of process. But I will tell you that her team, her chief residents, gave them the night off the next night and said, "Don't come back till your next shift on
Wow.
Sunday."
Wow.
And that would not have happened when I was in training. And that probably wouldn't have happened maybe even 5 years ago. So I will say that we are getting better. We are getting better at supporting one another
Uh-huh.
and understanding that the team is as strong as I don't wanna say the weakest person on the team, but maybe the person that needs the most support.
Right.
And so I was really proud of her for reaching out, and I felt really honored that she felt like I was a safe space for her to be able to do that, because that's not easy.
Yeah. I have noticed that as a believer, a true believer in coaching, that there are some people who I've worked with who just continue to believe that it's not for them. And I don't want to sound like evangelical about it, but would you agree that there are people that just aren't going to utilize those kinds of services, even though the rest of us are saying that they're so helpful?
I think so. I mean, I think that we're all different and where we're going on our journey. And I think that it's hard. We pride ourselves on practicing evidence-based medicine, right? And mostly gone are the days of this is just how we do it,
Yeah.
right? Like that answer, especially when we're working with trainees, is not going to fly anymore.
Right. Right.
But I do think that there are certainly providers and people that are not willing to do that hard work, because that's not easy work. It's not easy work to change a mindset or to change how you view things.
Mhm. Mhm.
I am not an optimistic person. And so I always assume the worst is going to happen. So, I think I've had to do a lot of work around that piece of like, what happens if good stuff happens? What happens if that goes the way you want it to go? And I would say not as much clinically, but certainly in my leadership experiences of, sort of thinking like in a more negative way. And so coaching has been really helpful around that. And I think that especially when you put yourself in a space where you're willing to try, I think that is very different than somebody who's like, "I don't need that. I'm never gonna change. I don't acknowledge that anything's wrong."
Mhm.
You know, that's okay. I think I feel bad that they're gonna be really old when they finally realize maybe they could've maybe they could've grown a little bit, but, change is hard. Change is hard.
Yeah. Well, listen, Natalie, I want to thank you so much for this conversation today. It's been so nice to get to know you in a couple of places we've run into each other, and thank you for sharing your time with me today in this audience.
Yeah, it's been great. I really appreciate the time. I'm so appreciative of you reaching out after that conference. It was a daunting topic of talking about conflict management and those types of things. So I appreciate that it resonated with you. I really am excited about the work that you're doing and hope you have a lot of success.
Wow, thank you so much. I think one of the loneliest experiences in medicine is believing that everyone else is handling it better than you are, that everyone else has figured it out and you haven't. Everyone else can carry the load and you can't. But listening to Natalie today, I started thinking about that resident who reached out after a bad shift, not because she had all the answers or because she knew exactly what to do, but she was aware she couldn't carry it alone. And maybe that's the lesson. Not that medicine gets easier, not that bad outcomes stop hurting, not that conflict disappears. It's just that none of those things were ever meant to be carried alone. We spend a lot of time in medicine trying to become indispensable. Maybe the healthier goal is becoming connected. If this episode resonated you, please share it with a colleague. This is Dr. Steven Sears. Thank you for listening to another episode of Heal the Burn.